Hi to anyone who's joined us. We're going to give it a couple minutes before we start, just so people have time to jump in here.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. And first of all, I'd like to pay our respect to traditional owners all over the world and to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the Google News Initiative Google Analytics 4 series. The Google News Initiative works side by side with publishers and journalists to build a more sustainable, diverse and innovative news ecosystem. And we know that Google Analytics has been one of the fundamental tools in news publishers' kits now for well over 10 years. So you could really say it's part of the furniture of publishing. And having held such a central position in how publishers measure and report and even plan their businesses, we realize it might be daunting, especially for those publishers who manage their own analytics, to move to this entirely new method and system of measurement in Google Analytics 4, which is why we've partnered with the global digital media experts, Media Monks, across the whole region to provide both scaled and more individual support to help you through this transition to the Google Analytics 4 platform. So we're starting with this series of 5 webinars, which are free to attend and will be available on demand afterwards if you want to share them with your colleagues or other publishers that you think may be interested or may benefit from them. That'll be followed by what we're calling cohort office hours, again, available for all, Those cohort office hours are going to address the top frequently asked questions and pain points from publishers that have come up during the webinars. And we would welcome suggestions and feedback for these that can be sent via the survey form that we'll share at the end of each webinar. We're also going to have a small number of individual office hours and implementation support sessions, and those will be available to selected publishers on an application basis, and there'll be more details to come on that soon. As I said, all the webinars are going to be recorded and available on demand, so please feel free to dip in and out of them or revisit them later. There's a lot of content, and Media Monks have done a fantastic job pulling it together. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kate from Media Monks to start taking you through the content. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate. As Chris said, I'm from Media Monks, and we are partnering with Google to deliver these webinars and implementation support sessions for Google Analytics 4. I have worked on a few Google News Initiative projects in the past few years, and I've really enjoyed everything we've done with Google News Initiative, and I know how helpful it can be for publishers because you guys are often working with such tight budgets and often working at such a fast pace. So I'm really excited to be part of this as well and to introduce you guys to this new platform, which should really help solve a lot of business problems you might be facing at the moment. So just to start off with a little bit about the program, we will be running office hours and implementation support that will be open for applications to be participating in. So there'll be a little bit more information on that later on. So keep an eye out on the website for these sessions. At the completion of the program, you can expect to have best practice GA4 implementation knowledge, as well as an understanding of how to utilize your data to improve your business results. So because this is a Google News Initiative program, we are focusing specifically on data implementations for publishers and how to use this platform as a publisher, because obviously you would have so many different requirements and business objectives to so many other businesses that would use this platform. Going throughout the session today, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask a question on the website. And we'd be more than happy to try and answer what we can. I'm sure that we'll do our very best to answer everything you come up with, but feel free to put some challenging ones in there. So today we're going to be covering kind of like the overview of the roadmap and features of the platform. So this is really a high-level introduction to what it is, how it works, and how you can expect it to integrate with your business. So we're going to start off with some general concepts of how to best build a data-driven publisher business. We're then going to go into an introduction to the platform, GA4. Then we'll discuss something that we get a lot of questions about, which is the differences between GA4 and the old version, or the current version, I guess you could say, GA Universal. We're going to talk about some terminologies that we will be using in GA4. And then we're going to go through the roadmap and pricing to give you more of an idea of the business sense of the platform as well. So, as I said, if you do have questions, feel free to ask them on the site. But I'm also going to leave some time at the end to try and answer any questions you might have ad hoc as well. All right, so we might as well just jump straight into it. First of all, I just wanted to run through the overall importance of building a data-driven business, especially for a publisher. And some of the ways that we can kind of build use cases out of the opportunities we have from GA4. So according to a study conducted by Deloitte, they found that digitally driven news and media organizations perform significantly better compared to digitally nascent peers. So these improvements aren't just in monetary results, they're not just in the bottom line, they're also in reader experience. But as a lot of you would know, those two things are often interconnected and should always be thought of as interconnected, because the better reader experience, the more subscriptions we'll see or the more impressions. So the two are kind of a symbiotic relationship. So as you can see here, the Deloitte study into data maturity found that digitally mature companies had around 20% more subscriptions than less mature, 20% higher CPMs, and a 40% higher click rate. So using data to kind of drive the strategy of your newsroom and to inform the way that you might develop content or market your editorial content can really make a difference to the reader experience and the bottom line. So how can we harness data as publishers? As a publisher, you probably are kind of drowning in a sea of many different technologies that are required to keep everything up and running. So first of all, you probably have a content management system or CMS, which is where you're actually building the articles and the editorial content that is on your website. You probably also have a CRM or a subscription management system, an SMS, that helps you to store and manage the information about your readers, your subscribers, whether they might be to your website itself or even just to your newsletter. So that's another layer of technology. You probably have an ad management software that you use for managing your inventory and for selling ad placements on your site. And then finally, you probably have a data analytics platform such as Google Analytics. So that's kind of where GA4 fits into this whole structure, is that with the data analytics platform, we want to combine all of the data points on your website, whether they be about visitor behavior, content performance, subscriptions, ad performance, to ultimately achieve business goals. So often for publishers, these goals will be things like growing your audience, engaging your audience, keeping them engaged, converting readers into subscribers if you have a subscription model, retaining your readers, so keeping them interested, and also maximizing ad revenue. So we really see GA4 as kind of the centerpiece that can drive all the strategy based on kind of this feedback loop of analyzing what's happening on your site and then responding to it to improve your performance. So building a data-driven business, it's always important to start from the ground up and to not try to jump into anything too complicated too early. So you want to start with a really strong foundation of data collection, right? So we want to make sure that the data we're collecting is relevant and that it is accurate. So you, as a publisher, you will have different data collection requirements from, an e-commerce site, for instance. As a publisher, you're going to want to collect data about content. So, article titles, publication dates, categories, things like that. Your readers, so about how often they interact with your site, what they like to read, and just their general interactions with your content and with the website itself. So that's where we want to start. And it doesn't really matter what you are trying to do in the end goal, whether it's maximizing revenue or growing your subscriber base. These will all have use cases for data analysis and activation. So everything requires that baseline, ground level data collection foundation. So when we start with that data collection foundation, it means that we're able to actually measure the impact of what we're putting in place. So as you kind of go up this ladder of, going into analysis of the data you're collecting and then into implementing use cases, that's where you can kind of actually measure what's happening on your site and to make sure that you're hitting KPIs instead of just kind of, working around in the dark and not really knowing what the impact is of what you're doing. So that is enough kind of about the foundations and the reason why we're actually doing all this, the reason why we think that GA4 is useful for a publisher. We're now going to go into the platform itself and to give you an idea of what it is and some of its main features as well. So GA4 is really, I guess at its most fundamental level, kind of a step forward in analytics that recognizes the huge increase in engagement with websites through apps and through mobile. So as you would all know, technology has advanced extremely quickly in the last couple of decades, and there's been a big shift from just desktop-based browsing to now apps and even just browsing the web on your phone. So GA4 kind of recognizes that shift and is trying to unify that desktop model and that app model so that we can analyze user behavior in both senses. So if you have an app as a publisher, you would maybe use Firebase for tracking your app, and you would use Google Analytics for tracking web. And historically, it's been a bit tricky to analyze across those two platforms. It's taken a bit of data analysis skill. GA4 is aiming to make that a lot easier, to unify those two measurement sources and to really focus on just interactions rather than necessarily desktop sessions and app sessions. So as you can see here, on the left-hand side, we've got an example of web tracking, whether it is through Google Analytics or another analytics platform. We've got on the right an example of app tracking. In this case, we're talking about Firebase. And so what Google Analytics 4 does is it brings in data from GA, from Firebase, consolidates into Google Analytics 4. So the measurement model is designed to unify both of those types of platforms. And the idea behind this is that it will give you a more comprehensive view of the user journey across those platforms. So in terms of some of the challenges publishers face, these are kind of some of the points we're trying to target in these trainings to help you to overcome these challenges with some of the solutions available in GA4. So first up, we've got a limited view of data and metrics across web and app. So often we hear from publishers that it's a challenge to unify or to identify the same user across web and app and to analyze both of them at once and to try and have some parity and to look at page views in the same way as screen views. What's the best way to do that? That is a challenge. Insufficient predictive capabilities without building complex models. So in terms of predictive modeling, a lot of publishers will probably struggle to find the resources to, build a machine learning model to figure out who's likely to convert, who's likely to churn. Historically, that's involved a fair bit of resourcing and a data scientist in the team, which is probably not possible for a lot of publishers. With GA4, there is a solution to this problem. Another challenge is being unable to analyze the customer experience across touch points. So, if someone starts their journey on web and then ends it on the app, how are we going to analyze that as one journey? And also a lack of direct integrations to Google Ad Manager and media buying platforms to drive actions. So for a lot of you, Google Ad Manager and selling your ad inventory on your site is probably a really crucial part of your business and your revenue model. So obviously you would want that data to be as accessible as possible and connected to your on-site behavioral data as well. So these are the solutions in terms of GA4 features. So first up, we have cross-platform analytics, which is designed to tackle the problem of the web and app disparity and tracking across those two platforms at once. We have predictive analytics, which is a really cool GA4 feature that kind of gives you an out-of-the-box predictive modeling capability. So you don't need to hire that really expensive data scientist. The customer journey is a central feature of GA4, so enabling you to analyze those different touch points we discussed, and also media activation. So a stronger focus on media activation and ensuring that those GAM integrations are as strong as possible. So I think that this is kind of a good chance to go through an overview of GA4 and how it's ended up where it is. So GA started way back in 2005 when Google Analytics acquired Urchin. If you were a marketer and you use UTM parameters, then that started with Urchin. Urchin is the U in UTM. And so that was kind of the beginning of the Google Analytics tracking story. This was then rebranded to Classic Analytics in 2007, which was when the iPhone was introduced. And it's kind of crazy that was only 16 years ago, because as a millennial, that just seems like it's been in my entire life. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not a very long time, and a lot has changed in that short span. In 2012, Universal Analytics and the SDK were introduced. And then in 2015, we've kind of got a point here where we saw really the impact of mobile and particularly smartphones on web behavior, where we saw mobile queries overtaking desktop. So people more likely to use their phone to browse the web than their computer. We saw Firebase launch in 2016. So Google's answer to tracking on app to respond to this resurgence or this surgence in app activity. And then in 2018, GA4 was introduced in beta. In 2020, it moved out of beta, and now we have it available for us, kind of looking forward ahead at the changes that are coming. So things like cookie deprecation. GA4 is designed to not only address the changes that have happened in terms of web and app, but also to be future prepped for the cookie deprecation that is kind of on the horizon. So that's kind of the evolution, and it gives you a good sense of the features that are prioritized in GA4 and why they're being prioritized. It really is designed to be something that is useful and current in 2023. So let's go through some of the main features. So the first one, which I've kind of touched on, is the event-based data model. So this is where we're moving away from web and app being considered separate and just focusing on events in themselves. Cross-platform analysis, so web and app data streams in the same property. Better user identification, so we have more ways to do some identity resolution of our users than just using cookies. Predictive analytics, which I've touched on, and some more advanced custom reports that mean you don't need to learn how to code to do some advanced analysis. I'm going to go into each of these in detail, so don't worry if you didn't understand what all of those things were. So first up, the event-based data model. So as users of GA would know, or of Universal Analytics would know, the UA data model has been historically really based on sessions. So the idea of a group of interactions in one visit to a website, that's a session. That's kind of what we've used as the, I guess, the fundamental way of analyzing behavior and of analyzing marketing performance has been the session. However, if we think about how we, interact with websites nowadays, I mean, maybe this is just me, but I open my phone like once every 20 seconds. So I don't necessarily act in sessions anymore. I'm more just acting in events and interactions. I probably will visit, ABC News on my phone. I'll visit it on the website, at least once or twice a day. So you kind of have these intermittent events that represent your journey rather than just one specific session on one platform. So this is why GA4 is moving towards this event-based model, where we consider events on the web as the same as an event on the app, and those can all be joined together in a user journey. So for me, I really like this data model. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it makes it a lot easier to analyze across web and app, and to kind of pick up on different things a user has done without being confined to that one session model. Additionally, with the event-based model, it allows a lot of customization. We're going to go into this in more detail later on, but you can really customize your implementation so that you're only tracking the things that matter to you. You won't have as much noise of events and parameters that aren't really relevant to your business. With GA4, you're designing your whole implementation pretty much from scratch with some recommendations and guidance from Google, so that enables you to say, these are the things that matter to us. This is what we're going to track, and we're going to just basically work off our custom events. So the next feature is cross-platform insights powered by user ID. So this enables measurement of the customer journey across devices and platforms to get a full picture of how users are interacting with content. So the user ID is obviously unique to your business, but it can be set as a field in GA by using Firebase or GTM to pass that user ID user property. That is a way that we can, first of all, rely on first-party data to identify users. So based on their logged in ID, we can say that this is this user, they were on this website, they had a web session, they had an app session, this is their full journey. And GA4 will recognize that if it's chosen as a method of identification. So you can set up in your configuration, I want to use user ID to recognize users, and whatever parameter you've pushed through will be used by GA4 to perform identity resolution. So this is a really great inbuilt way to rely on user ID for all of your measurement, just as the basis of your data collection, rather than having to have a separate property for user IDs or something like that. This is really quite out of the box. So when this is enabled, you can measure journeys that include a visit to a website and a conversion in an app. Because we're going off the user rather than the cookie, it means we get a far better view of what that user has done, and particularly for your most valuable readers, so your subscribers or your really frequent visitors, they're often going to be having journeys on both platforms. So this is a much better way to look at your users and to understand what they're interested in and what they're doing. As another note, in the future, you will be able to leverage Google Signals for cross-platform measurement. So this is data available from Google in the backend that kind of provides a few more details about your users from Google's profiles. So this will be leveraged as well in the future. But as a publisher, the user ID really is the best unifier to use instead of just relying on cookies. So next up, we have this predictive analysis. This is a really cool feature. This is an inbuilt machine learning model where GA4 will make predictions that are just readily available to you and your business. So it works based on logging a purchase event. You might not all have, a traditional purchase event on your site, but you can be creative and use the e-commerce funnel in different ways. Maybe a subscription is what you call a purchase, and that will enable GA4 to automatically give you an out-of-the-box predictive audience based on, past purchase events. GA4 can say, okay, we saw all these past subscriptions, and based on the profiles of those people, we think that this is the audience who is likely to convert, or we think that this is the audience that's likely to churn, right? So this is really amazing to have this available out of the box, because it is usually quite a complicated thing to build. For example, in Google Cloud Platform, it takes a bit of know-how to build something like this. So I highly recommend looking into this, and especially if you have a subscription model, trying to get this configured yourself. So this enables you to get your insights automatically surfaced. So GA4 will also kind of generate automatic insights about what it thinks is going to happen on your site. So for instance, it might, recognize, okay, you've had this many sessions in the past, couple of months. We think in this next week, you're going to have this many sessions. And if there is an anomaly or an unexpected value, GA4 will shout it out. So on your homepage, you end up getting these insights that say, hey, we expected you to have this many sessions, but you actually had this many, and that was an anomaly. So it will call out unexpected behaviors, it'll make recommendations, and it really is just a very clever inbuilt brain in the system that's analyzing your data specifically. So predictive analytics, very cool, very exciting to have that available out of the box. GA4 exploration. So if you've used UA, you probably have used custom reports. So custom reports are where we can use custom dimensions to build reports that are, I'm going to say custom 1,000 times, but custom to your business. The exploration section in GA4, which you might have noticed if you've been in the platform, is kind of an advanced version of the custom report. So it really allows you to do some more detailed analysis to kind of build advanced funnels and user pathway analysis that usually you would have to do with a bit of SQL in BigQuery or something like that. So it's a good way to kind of drag and drop your dimensions and your metrics, especially when you're first getting used to the new data model of GA4 and trying to figure out how everything's working for your business. I've found it really useful for me getting used to the platform to just, build a report and drag things into different places, drop things into different places, and just kind of do that automatically in the UI, because it doesn't take as much work as going into BigQuery and having to write some SQL. So something that's really cool in here is particularly probably funnels, where you can build funnels with very specific conditions. I want to see people who came from this campaign, and then within 5 minutes they went and looked at the subscription page, but then they didn't subscribe, something like that, right? You can kind of have that level of detail with the funnels here, which is much more advanced than what we had available in UA, which is really cool. So definitely have a look at this. There's also some reporting options in here for segment overlap, which is one I use a lot, where you can look at a segment of users, maybe they're new users, then you can look at a segment of returning users, and you can see the overlap with those segments and, subscribers, right? So you can have a look at the way that different types of segments of users interact with each other. And it's a really visual way that is a lot easier particularly for me, for my brain to understand than just looking at the numbers on a page. Okay. And another feature to call out is the deeper integration that we have with GMP and with some other tools. So we have, for instance, integrations available with, ad manager, campaign manager, so your ad platforms, as well as Optimize and GTM and things like that. But there are also a lot of opportunities to bring in data from other parts of the business. So, for instance, we've got Salesforce, where you can push data from your CRM into GA4 or from another CRM as well, if you've got the ability to build out that pipeline for custom data import. We also have, those connections with Looker Studio, with Looker itself, the more advanced version of Looker Studio, and Tableau. So this data can be leveraged in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different platforms to help you gain some more valuable insights and also to share the data throughout the business more easily. Okay. So just to show a quick comparison of the platforms, we have a free version of GA4 and an enterprise version. It works slightly differently to how this worked in UA with UA and UA 360. With GA4, there are some features that are available for free that weren't previously. The big one for me is the BigQuery export. That's now available for free in the free version. There is a limit of 1 million daily event exports. So if you are processing a lot of events or if you are using BigQuery a lot to build data models, then the enterprise version is probably worth looking at. But going down the list, you can see that there are generally some different limits. So, for example, with conversions in GA4, you can label 30 events as conversions. In 360, you will get 50. With audiences, we have 100 in GA4. In 360, there's 400. And you can see that there are also different thresholds for the number of parameters, custom dimensions and metrics, and user scoped dimensions. So there are differences between the two, and we're going to go into more detail a bit later on how the pricing works, which is also a change from UA. So stay tuned for that if that is something that's of interest to you, but just wanted to call it out now that there are those two different versions like we had with UA. Okay, I'm going to try and answer some questions before I keep going. Is custom events created in GTM, will they work in GA4? Yes, we've just had a question about whether custom events created in GTM will work in GA4. Yes, they will, as long as you've set up your configuration tag to send your data to GA4. We have another webinar, I'm pretty sure it's webinar 3, don't hold me to that, pretty sure, where we're going to talk about the actual technical implementation within GTM. And one of the great things about GA4 is that you can use existing triggers that you've used for UA to send events for GA4. So I won't go into too much detail now, but the short answer is yes, you can use GTM and you can use a lot of your existing setup of analytics triggers to push events to GA4. To look at, as a question around seeing much more page views in GA4 than UA, and any idea why that might be. I would check, if I was you, that you have only installed, that you've not set a separate page view event from the configuration tag. So something that people don't realize first often is that the configuration tag for page views will send a page view itself. So make sure you just have that one configuration tag. You don't need to make a separate page view event. That's probably something I check. Apart from that, yeah, just make sure that you only have one event name that is page view, basically. You probably checked that already, but yeah, I think the main reason would probably be the configuration tag, because I've made that mistake before myself. And session duration. Do we have a similar report available for session duration in GA4? So it's a little bit different. As I've said, GA4, we're focused a bit less on the idea of sessions and more on engagements. I'd have to come back to you on that one, but there should be, I'm pretty sure you have a session duration report. I don't think it'll be an out-of-the-box report the same way that it is in UA. GA4 is more designed to be something where you can build custom reports and really only use the reports that matter. So you don't necessarily get that big stack of out-of-the-box reports. So what I would do is, if I was you, is just play around in the explore section with your metrics and your dimensions. You'll probably be able to build your own report for this particular metric, and then you can add that to the UI. Again, a lot of the detail on that is going to be in later sessions. Today it's more just an overview, but hopefully that gives you somewhere to start. And how long does GA4 keep data? I don't know the exact time periods off the top of my head, but the enterprise version does have a longer storage period than the free version. Okay, you guys have lots of good questions. This has been challenging already. I'm going to keep going for now, but I'll try to get to all of your questions by the end of the session. So, account architecture. So with GA4, the account architecture is slightly different to what you would be familiar with from UA. So in GA4, we have at our very base level a data stream. So that's kind of just a source of data. It's where the actual data is coming from to the platform. Then we have a property. This is where the data is sent, and this represents really one user base or one one domain effectively. And then we have an account. And an account is a collection of all of your properties, similar to what you have in UA. So to give you some more detail on these, first up, this is what you will see in the platform when you are looking at the architecture. So you'll see, if you go into admin, similar to UA, you've got your account level, and then you've got your property level. No views. Views are not a feature of GA4. We no longer use views. We just have properties. Within properties, we have data streams, which is where your data is sent. But a lot of the features of views that we previously used are now inbuilt into GA4. So for example, whenever I would set up a reporting view in UA, I would apply bot filtering. I would exclude test traffic. I would only include external traffic. I'd exclude anything from my internal office, for instance. GA4 does a lot of this automatically or in other ways, so we don't really have as much need for a view as we did in UA. The focus now is more on properties, data streams, and using comparisons to filter your data. So the account level. So this is your access point to analytics. Generally used for organizational purposes mainly. There isn't much going on in the account other than what you might want to use for user management and access management and security, things like that. You need an account to use analytics, but some companies might have many depending on business needs. So if you are part of a big conglomerate that has a lot of subsidiaries, you might have many different accounts. Properties. So properties is what you're more likely going to be using day to day. This represents the digital properties of your company. So an account can have one property or it can have many properties, but generally a property will represent a one-to-one relationship with a real life digital property. So you might have a property for your website and a property for your app. Now with GA4, there are a couple of ways you can handle roll-up reporting. This is a 360 feature, but you can create a roll-up property that will bring all of those other properties together if you want to look at everything at once. You might have a property with sub-properties, so the property itself will receive all data, and then you create sub-properties for the different data streams. It's kind of up to you. You can have one property with multiple data streams, but it's kind of recommended just to have a web stream and at most one app stream each for iOS and Android, just to kind of keep everything consolidated, and then to use roll-ups if you do need to go and bring multiple properties together. So what is a data stream? So a data stream is really where we're sending the data. So each of these will have a tracking ID, and that's what you're going to put into GTM when you make your configuration tag to send data to GA4. So it's a little ID, G dash something or other. And then that will go into the GTM tag, and that will say, send the data to this property. Sorry, yes, to this property, to the data stream in this property. Sorry, I'm not making this too confusing. So if you have app and web, web you will probably be setting up in GTM, and you'll be sending your data that way. With app, if you're using Firebase, you can also send your data to that property using data streams as well. So as I mentioned earlier, it's best to have a maximum of 3 per property. So 1 for web, 1 for iOS, and 1 for Android. And that way, you can just kind of make sure that everything's consolidated, that you only have these 3 individual sources. And if one of them has a problem, you know exactly where to look to fix it. So for an app data stream, you can have 1 data stream for a combination of app package name and platform. So for your Android app. And for web data stream, in most cases, you should use the single web data stream. So it's you can run into a lot of issues if you're trying to have multiple data streams for web with conflicting events and things like that, and also just an extra load on your website. So it's best to just use the 1 data stream to send that all to the 1 property. Okay, hopefully that all makes a bit of sense. I'm now going to go through some of the differences between GA4 and UA. Hopefully this might address some of the questions that have just come through, but if not, I'll have a look at the end. So let's jump into this section, and we'll see how we go. Okay, so GA Universal versus GA4. So GA Universal was originally designed web first, so it's really excellent for website analytics. You have the free and the enterprise versions with limits that you would hit, with sampling and hit counts, and obviously more available with 360. Customization capabilities, so you can use custom dimensions and metrics, you can use roll-up reporting, and also robust reporting. So a lot of reports available out of the box. I think kind of addressed this earlier with the questions that a difference between UA and GA4 is UA had a huge stack of reports that were just available as they were and couldn't really be changed. GA4 is a bit different in how it approaches that. With GA4, we're talking more of a cross-platform, so web and app, reflecting how we think about business and how the digital landscape has changed recently. Free or enterprise, so you can use this at no cost with limited hits or with higher limits for data collection, reporting, and BigQuery export. Unlimited event reporting, no hit limits, so you can see all of your data. We'll get a bit later on into how the pricing works for hits. As I said, it's different to UA. And simple yet powerful, so automatic setup with out-of-the-box reporting with raw data export for detailed analysis. So where UA gave you a lot of out-of-the-box reports for kind of, your simple reporting, so acquisition and page, content reports, things like that. GA4 asks you to customize and to build reports that actually matter to you. And then it provides a lot of more advanced features on building custom reports and accessing advanced analysis that previously would have taken a bit of extra effort and a bit of extra knowledge to do. So this gives you an idea of how the 4 different versions effectively work. So we've got UA and GA4, and then within that we've got free and paid. So we've got 4 different versions. As you might know, we currently have a sunset date approaching for free Universal Analytics of July 1st. So if you are on the free version, now is definitely the time to move to GA4, to get your event set up, to get that tracking code on your site so that you're ready to make the transition. Because yes, it will be sunset in just a couple of months. With 360 UA, you have a bit longer, but I would still recommend trying to transition now. The more time you have, the better. So it's definitely worth getting onto GA4 and getting used to it and ensuring that you've got, parity between 2 platforms with dual tagging before you are required to be on GA4. That's something that I've found really valuable, is having both at once, making sure I've got all of my events doing the right things in the right places. With GA4 free, we've kind of gone over a number of the features. So all of those things we've spoken about, the event-based model, the enhanced measurement, the cross-platform functionality with user ID, and the built-in machine learning, they are all available in the free version, which is great. However, with 360, you're getting unlimited hits and a lot more integration. So, depending on the size of your business, the number of hits you get, and also your reliance on third-party tools, 360 might be a better option for you with GA4. So let's get into some of the comparisons of the data models. This is really important because this is probably the biggest shift in terms of actually using the platforms between UA and GA4. So with UA, as I've said, we were working more with a session-based model. So users had sessions, and sessions consisted of lots of different hits, be they page views or events, e-commerce, whatever. So sessions were kind of considered separate, and that was just based on the definition of, no more than 30 minutes between two hits, time of day, at midnight you would start a new session, or acquisition source. So those were kind of the definitions of sessions, which are probably not as relevant now that we have more of an app-based browsing world. So that's why with GA4, instead of worrying about sessions, we just think of the user and their events. We still have a way to access the idea of a session. GA4 has a session start event inbuilt that roughly corresponds with the definition from UA, but the focus should be more on events and on the user rather than on sessions. So that's why we're using this event-based model. Now, the good thing about this is that it really does make analysis a lot simpler, in my opinion. I think the event-based model is far easier to customize and to use for your own implementation and for your own analysis than kind of the disparate models we had between web and app previously. So with Universal, a hit was any kind of interaction, but that was kind of split out into three different categories: events, page views, and e-commerce. And events had three parameters attached. They had the category, the action, and the label. So you were sometimes trying to kind of fit a fair bit of information or metadata into those three parameters. Whereas now, now that everything is an event, you can attach as few or as many parameters as you need with a ceiling. Obviously, you can't have thousands, but you probably won't need thousands. So I think there is a limit of 25 per event in free GA4, but I would have to double check that. Anyway, the point is, with your event, you can have as many parameters as you need. So this means that a page view, for instance, will have parameters attached in the same way that a scroll event will have parameters attached, in the same way that a session start event will have parameters attached. And you're not constrained by, having to choose particular names for your parameters. You don't have to call it, category, action, label. You can call them whatever you want, whatever makes sense to your business, and attach those to the events. So it makes it a lot easier internally to figure out where things are, because you can say, here's our page views and here's our parameter called article name. Here's a session start and here's the parameter called user ID or is subscriber, right? So the parameter names are far more customized and easy to interpret. So just to kind of summarize that point, if we look at the two platforms next to each other, you can see that those three different hit types of page view, well, four, I guess, page view and screen view, event and e-commerce event are now just all an event. That's it. We don't have to think of them separately anymore. And that things that were previously custom dimensions or e-commerce dimensions are now just parameters. Okay, so everything's an event with an attached parameter. The one distinction is that with user level custom dimensions, so that's things like membership status, user ID. I can't think of another example, but I'm sure you can. Those would be user properties now, right? So it's important to know when you're making a parameter, especially in GTM, is this an event parameter? So does it just apply to this one event? Or is this a user property? Does it apply to this user for all of their journeys? So things like your user ID must be a user property. Once it's set, that's it. That's the user ID for that person, and all of their future events will have that user property associated with them. So that is kind of the key distinction there. With, you'll see in GTM, if you're doing that configuration, you'll have fields to set, which are your parameters. Those are event level. Your user properties are user level. So that's important to remember. In terms of looking at the two platforms and the metrics between them. So this is something where people have a lot of questions, because we tend to find that a lot of businesses are really married to the idea of sessions and are scared of letting sessions go. You don't have to let them go completely, but I think it is good to maybe refocus on users going forward. But you can still use sessions with GA4, which I will explain. So with Universal, with GA Universal, we had the primary metric of users, which was simply a total number of users. So effectively, that was the total number of cookies or app IDs that were visiting the site, all the distinct identifiers that we had. Obviously, that is not necessarily going to deduplicate users that have been on web and on app. So you would always take that with a grain of salt, keeping that in mind. With GA4, now that we're focusing more on identity resolution and using the user ID, this is kind of redefined as the total number of unique users who logged an event. Okay. Remembering that an event can just be a page view. So, pretty similar to what we had in Universal, but we do have that ID resolution for users that are logged in on web and app. Page views, total number of pages viewed. In GA4, we're now kind of thinking of that more as views because of the focus on consolidating web and app together. If you don't have an app, that doesn't matter. It will just be the total page views. If you do have an app, views can be your, number of app screen views plus the number of web screen views, page views. Sessions in Universal were defined by time, campaigns, date boundaries, as I mentioned earlier, and also could reset by the client as well. So those specific rules don't necessarily make as much sense anymore with our new ways of browsing the web. In GA4, a session is initiated when an app is opened in the foreground or when a web page is opened. So a session ends after 30 minutes of inactivity on the part of the user, and a new campaign does not begin a new session. So you can see that we do have a similar definition here, that we have an app being opened in the foreground or a web page being opened defining a session, and that we do have that 30-minute limit. And the way that we count sessions in GA4 is with the session start event being logged. So that will be logged when these conditions are met. So as I said, you don't have to completely give up on sessions. You still have that idea of a session start. But in terms of reporting, it is probably best to move away from sessions, more to users, and to look at the engagement of users rather than necessarily just the total number of sessions. So if you think about something like acquisition, GA4 makes a distinction between the acquisition source of a session, as well, like a visit, and the first acquisition source of the user. So we kind of have this more holistic view of where people are coming from, not necessarily just relying on that last click to assign value to an acquisition source. So I think it's good to kind of explore these, more advanced ways of looking at acquisition and looking at where users are coming from instead of just relying on that traditional session concept. And finally, conversions. In UA, we would use goals to define conversions. In GA4, we specify events as conversion events. So super easy to do. In the configure section of GA4, you can assign simply just by pressing this little slidey thing. You can slide on that an event is a conversion, and that's it. So nice and easy to do, and there are a lot of analysis capabilities still available with those. Okay, metric comparison. So a little bit more of this just on one of the questions we often get, which is about bounce rate. A lot of businesses are also very married to bounce rate, and I had someone yesterday who was telling me, I can't give up on bounce rate. I've used it for 20 years. Like, you can't take it away from me. I totally understand. So GA Universal defined bounce rate as the percentage of single page sessions where there was no interaction with the page. So for instance, I open a web page and then I just leave. I don't do anything else. That would have a duration of 0 seconds because we only log one event when I arrive on the page. No event is logged when I leave, so there's no way to calculate a session duration. So bounces were just single page events with a 0 second duration in the system. So that was historically a bounce. In GA4, the definition's a little more nuanced because GA4 is kind of moving more towards this idea of an engaged session. So an engaged session is a session that lasts at least 10 seconds. So you'll see if you look at the network requests on your site, that GA4 will log a user engagement event after you've been on the site for at least 10 seconds. That means that that's not a bounce. So it's a way of kind of measuring actual time on page, even if there's no interaction. And if, as a publisher, you might not have an interaction event logged when someone's reading an article. So it might be inaccurate to describe that as a bounce, for instance. So an engaged session lasts at least 10 seconds, or it has one or more conversion events, or it has 2 or more page or screen views. So in practice, this is really quite similar to the historic definition. It just kind of ensures that we're going to take into account engaged sessions that would have previously been considered a bounce just because they didn't have another interaction. So if someone has a session where they only have one page view, but they spend, 20 or 25 seconds on the site, that will not be considered a bounce. Same if they have, a conversion event, that will not be considered a bounce. So this also kind of handles situations where someone might have a page open, not do anything for 30 minutes and then have a conversion event. That will then not be considered a bounce. So I guess the upshot of all this is that bounces are kind of the inverse of an engaged session, right? So an engaged session meets these criteria I've described. The bounce rate is just 1 minus percentage of engaged sessions. Okay, so you'll find that you do have a very similar trend in how this looks compared to your historic bounce rate. The definitions are really very similar, but there's kind of this idea of moving more towards looking at engagement rather than bouncing. So, which page had the highest engagement rate as a landing page versus which landing page had the lowest engagement rate. Particularly as a publisher, like you're really looking for engagement with what you're doing, with your content. So this is kind of designed to focus on that idea of engagement rather than just looking at a bounce. So in conclusion, bounce rate is not dead. You can get bounce rate as the percentage of sessions that were not engaged sessions. Okay, I'm going to try and answer a couple of questions before I move on. We have a lot coming through, so I will do my best. So let's see. Do we have 10 million page views in Universal Analytics, or do we need 360? We have 10 million page views in Universal Analytics. Do we need 360 version? Okay, so something to keep in mind with hit limits is that they're if you think about UA, you would hit your hit limit usually if you had a really big time frame, right? So sampling would occur when you hit a certain number of hits, which would often happen if you've got a bigger time frame, right? Because you're looking at a longer time, you're going to have way more hits. In terms of whether you need 360 or UA, I guess it really depends on how large of a time frame you use for reporting, and whether you're going to hit that minimum tier of hits really early, or if you're going to kind of stay within the minimum tier of hits, your biggest reporting range. So I would stay kind of tuned for the end where we go through the pricing model, where we talk about the different tiers, because basically you will have kind of graded levels of cost depending on how many hits you have. So you might be on a base tier that will be a fair bit cheaper than UA 360 because you have like a smaller number of hits. So it really depends on the publisher. Depends on how you do your reporting. I would say, if you're hitting that many hits within 3 days, you probably would want to be on 360 because you're going to hit a limit pretty early. What else do we have here? GA4 suitable to track multiple domains, subdomains. Yes, absolutely. So all of your tracking in GTM, you can send multiple subdomains to the same data stream. It's good to just have one data stream, but if you have your domain and your subdomains, you can send that to the one data stream if you want. The difference between data streams in GA4 and views in UA. So a data stream really is the source of your data. It's the raw data that's coming in. A view was more like a filtering of data that was already there. So a view is where we take the raw data in the property, which is effectively what a data stream gives us in GA4. You would take the raw data of the property and you'd apply a filter to only look at certain subsets. So you'd say, I want to filter out internal traffic. I want to filter out bot traffic. I want to only look at traffic from Australia or something. I'm not sure. That doesn't exist as a concept in GA4. We have other ways of dealing with those things. Most of the exclusions for bots and internal traffic are built in. And where you might, use views to look at subsets of users, we have comparisons, which are kind of like a segment you can apply. We don't go into much detail on comparisons in this session, but we will later on. You'll see it like up the top right of your reporting screen where you can play around with filtering your data for different countries or domains or subdomains or apps or websites, whatever it is, using those comparisons to see that subset of data. How can we evaluate user data for different platforms separately, web and app, if a user's data is captured against a single user ID? Does GA4 provide differentiation? Yes, absolutely. So while we have that consolidated idea of user ID, in the data model, we'll still always have those dimensions attached or the parameters attached saying web, app, page view, screen view, where you can separate out or segment or filter for just the web session or just the app session. So that's more than possible in the platform using comparisons or using filters in your reports or in BigQuery as well. Multiple subdomains and domains to data streams. Yes, we can. I think we've had that one earlier. So that's a good question. Yep. So depending on how you're doing your tracking, if you're doing it by GTM, then yes, you can add multiple. How do you implement a roll-up using GA4? Will this be covered in one of the webinars? So with GA4, the roll-up is a 360 feature, so you do need to be on 360. I'm not sure if we're covering it in the webinars, so sorry, I can't quite answer that one for sure. But it's a 360 feature and it works very similarly to UA. It's really easy to set up. You kind of have your separate properties and you say create roll-up property and you tell GA which ones you want in there. So obviously best practices, you don't want overlap between your properties. You shouldn't really ever have overlap between your properties. They should be kind of distinct data streams, right? So, one for one website, one for another website, right? And the roll-up should just consolidate all of that together. So very similar to UA, but yes, it is a GA360 feature. So if you haven't seen it in the platform, that might be why. Any mechanisms to track the invalid IVT traffic? Confession that I'm not sure what IVT is, but if you're referring to kind of invalid bot traffic or internal traffic, bot traffic is automatically detected by GA4, so that will be excluded by default. Internal traffic, there is a parameter you can attach to traffic called traffic type. So whatever you're using for tagging, GTM, I'm just going to keep using as an example. You can have a parameter attached to a user that says traffic type internal. That will be excluded with internal filters that you can set up in GA4. So hopefully that is helpful. GA4 and app analytics at no cost with limited hits. May I know the number? Yes, you may. I will get to it at the end because I don't know it off the top of my heart, but we have a little explanation of how the tiers work. I'm pretty sure it's 25 million, but we'll find out in a little bit if I'm correct about that. Any standard practices to store historic data? Yeah, sure. So I think, I'm a a huge BigQuery lover, so I would probably be using a data warehouse solution like that to be storing historic data, especially if you've got UA data and you're trying to kind of consolidate things over time. With GA4, the BigQuery export is free, so I would definitely take advantage of that. Store that as your backup, so that you've kind of got it saved in the cloud. That's probably what I would do. And can one user ID make some admin or moderator for remote access maintained by someone else? Can one user ID make some admin or moderator for remote access? I'm not sure if I understand this question. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, if we're talking about permissions, similar to UA where we have admin permissions to grant roles. But sorry, if you want to rephrase that, maybe that's best. I might have misunderstood. Okay, let's keep trucking along. A couple more sections to get through. Thank you all for the questions. They're really very good. You're all very switched on about this already. I'm very impressed. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the terminology you see in GA4. This usually helps when you first get your hands on a new platform and it's a bit overwhelming. Most of the challenge is just learning all the different terminology that is used. So first up, we have events. I've spoken a lot about these, but if you're not sure, these are distinct user interactions on your website or your app. So for example, loading a page is an event. So page views, we now think of as events. Clicking a link is an event. Completing a purchase is an event. So all interactions, you have to set up tracking for these interactions to be considered events. And I'm going to go into more detail now on how that specifically works. So we have 4 types of events. We have automatically collected events. Love those. We have enhanced event measurement. This is a great new feature in GA4 specifically. Recommended events, and finally custom events. So first up, automatically collected events. So these are the ones that will just be triggered by any interaction on your app or site, as long as you've got that Google Analytics for Firebase SDK, or you've got the global site tag, or you've got GTM installed. As long as you've got some kind of tracking solution installed, GTM or Firebase, you will collect these events. So basically, as soon as you set up a configuration tag that says, send my data to this data stream, and you install that Google Tag Manager snippet on your site, these events will come through. So these include session start, clicks, first visit. So the first time a new user is recognized by GA as being on the site, and user engagement, which we've discussed. And also page view is another one that will automatically be collected. Oh, and just to reiterate what we were saying earlier, configuration tag for GA4 will, because it's an automatically collected event, will send page views. So you don't need to make your own page view tag. In fact, don't make your own one, because then you will get duplicate page views. Sorry, I keep going back to this, but I would also say that when you first set this up, highly recommend jumping on your site after you've published the config tag alone and just seeing what's happening on your site, because you'll see some of these events come through. You wait a few seconds and you'll see that user engagement event come through. You'll get an idea of what's happening automatically from that config tag and what you don't need to worry about setting up separately. Okay, I will now move on. Now, along with these automatically collected events, there are also automatically collected parameters. So these are the ones that you do not need to set up in GTM. They will just be populated because they exist in the network request by default. So the data's already in there. You don't need to get a data layer in place to get this, to get these parameters. So these will go with every single event, including custom events you make. And they include language, page location, so that's page path, URL, referrer, where they came from, page title, and screen resolution. So these are always set in the network request, and GA4 will just pick up on them and collect them along with all of your events. So do not worry about setting up variables or data layer to collect these things. Okay. A new feature we have in GA4 is the idea of enhanced event measurement. So this is a really great feature if you're especially lacking on development resources or on, IT people. So enhanced event measurement enables you to track interactions with content by enabling optional events. And you don't need to add any additional code. So if you've done what I just described earlier, you've set up, you've put your Google Tag Manager snippet on the site, and you've set up a config tag that's sending data to GA4, then you can just tell GA4, please collect these events, and they will just be collected automatically, which is amazing. So these include things like scrolls, which is a really important one for publishers. So you can track article engagement, outbound clicks, site search, form interactions, video engagement, and file downloads. So there are some caveats around here. As you can see, there are certain requirements for these to work automatically. Those are all set out in the platform and online. I'm not going to go into detail on that now, but most of the time you can just turn these on and they will just start sending data to GA4 without having to bother any developers or, get some sprint set up for 6 months from now. So that is definitely something to look into. Recommended events. So these are the ones that GA4 will kind of identify as being something you might want to consider implementing. These will help you measure additional features and behavior, as well as generate more useful reports. So these aren't automatically set because you need to do a little bit of context work for GA4 to understand what the event corresponds with on your site. So for instance, a sign up, GA4 might recognize that you've got this kind of logged in feature, but it won't necessarily know how to track logins or how to store the login ID. So you need to go into GTM, you need to work with your developers to actually set up that event in your data layer. So it's a recommended event, but that doesn't mean you can just flick it on. It's just something to have a look at, think about, should we install this? Probably yes. So things like signups, logins, shares. In this case, we've got things about tutorials, those kinds of things that are probably really relevant to your site. GA4 can't collect them automatically, but it's really worth looking into setting these up. And custom events. So this is kind of the idea of an event you'd be most familiar with from UA. These are events that you set up yourself in GTM or Firebase. These have a name and a set of parameters so that you can collect information specific to your business. So an example given here is the article complete custom event. So you might set something up with your developers where when someone reaches the bottom of the text on the page, it might not necessarily be the whole page. It might just be the bottom of the text section that you care about. You log an article complete event on your web or on your app, and then that might have parameters attached. What's the name of the article? What is the time that it took them to read it, for instance? What was the published date of the article? Blah, 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 blah. So these are the custom ones we set up. They're extremely important because they are where you really get the relevant data for your business that's specific to your business. So these involve a little bit more work. Often you'd have to work with your developers or data analytics teams to set up the data layer and to set up the tagging for these, but really an essential thing to do, especially as a publisher where you have so much metadata to analyze. Now, I mentioned this earlier when I said about the little slidey thing that you can turn on to collect conversions. Here is an image of the slidey thing that I mentioned. That's definitely not the Google official name for it, but that's what I'm going to call it. So a conversion can be any event that is valuable to your business. You can just jump into the configuration section of the platform, no additional code required, and you can flick on that event as a conversion. This means that from that point onwards, GA4 will recognize that as a conversion and it will track it accordingly. So I'm not going to go into huge detail on the reporting of conversions now, but once this is marked as a conversion, GA4 will obviously recognize it as more significant and track it and recognize it and report on it in different ways to just a regular event. So we set up GA4 and you've done all your exciting event tracking and you've set up your signups and your newsletter subscriptions. You want to jump into the platform and mark those as conversions so that they are considered accordingly. So these are basically goals. These are goals, but the GA4 version, and they're really, really easy to set up. Next up, we have custom definitions. You'll see this in the configuration section as well. So you're probably familiar with custom dimensions and custom metrics from UA. These can be set in GA4 as well to give you some additional context data for reporting. There is a limit to the number of custom dimensions that you can have in the property, so you want to pick these carefully. And you also want to make sure that you're picking parameters that have low cardinality. If you don't know what that means, it just means that these are events that aren't going to have a million different values. So for instance, you don't want to have a custom dimension for user ID because that could have millions of different values and it can really slow down reporting. You don't really need to have that custom dimension either because user ID is set as a yes or no once you've configured it in GTM. So GA4 will recognize if someone has a user ID or not. You don't really need to see the specific value in the platform. So a high cardinality event is something like user ID, page path, time of day, where you're going to get infinite possible values. Low cardinality is what you might want to set up as a custom dimension. So these would be things for a publisher like content category, right? So we want to have that as a custom definition. It probably only has, 50 different values at most, and you can then use that for reporting in the platform. If you do have high cardinality dimensions that you want to analyze, I would recommend that would be a BigQuery job. It's best to not block the platform up with those because first of all, it's kind of impractical to analyze data of that that much data or that many values in a UI. You'd probably want to use SQL for that in BigQuery. And also it will tend to slow down reporting if you're trying to use those values as well. So I'd recommend setting up things like author, content category, user membership status. Those types of things are probably best to set up as custom definitions. Things like article ID and time of day and publish date, probably best to avoid setting those up as custom definitions in the UI. So just to make it really clear, those values are still being collected. They just aren't necessarily accessible within the GA4 platform. There's something that you can analyze in BigQuery and in other places like that, but it's best to use the platform for those lower cardinality definitions so that you have a lot better performance on the site. So a dimension is an attribute of data. I probably went into way too much detail on custom definitions before we're actually defining what a dimension is. Hopefully most of you know that it is a context variable that enables additional recording of data in GA4. So a dimension is it's a categorical value. So something like category, content category, content author, content name, that's a dimension. So for an example, if you've got a page view event, you're probably going to be logging a number of different dimensions as a publisher. You'll probably have article ID, publish date, content name, content category, content author. And that means that you then are able to access all of those values within GA4, within BigQuery, within Looker Studio to analyze the performance of those for your business intelligence. Using them in reports. So in GA4, you can use them in your built-in reports as a secondary dimension, similar to UA. You can always add a custom dimension onto those standard out-of-the-box reports, or you can use them in custom reports, either as a primary or as a secondary dimension. Metrics. So metrics are a quantitative measurement. So these are things like averages, ratios, percentages, etc. It's always a number. It's never text. So the best way to think of a metric is, can you apply math to it? Can you add two things together and it makes sense? 10 page views plus 15 page views. Yes, you can perform mathematical operations on that. It's a metric. Something like article ID, even though it's a number, it doesn't really make sense to multiply it or add it to anything. So that's a dimension, right? It's kind of a funny way to look at it, but if you just think of dimensions as labels of data and metrics as measurements, that's the best way to do it. So examples of metrics would be, total events, total users, total revenue, percentage of engaged sessions, total average sessions per user, something like that. They're aggregations, they're measurements, they're not dimensions. Okay, covered off a few of those things. I'm going to answer a couple of questions before I get to the last slide. How can we take a backup from Universal Analytics? Is there a tool you can suggest to help us fetch backup for full property? Yes, good question. If you don't have BigQuery export enabled, I'm not sure exactly how you could get a full export. If you have 360, it's a tricky one. If you have 360, you could potentially use an API to get it back up, but it's going to be a bit more technically complicated if you don't have BigQuery export already. Something to be aware of, though, is that you're not going to lose that data when the platform is sunset, that the data will still exist attached to the platform. You can I've recommended for some of my clients to use dashboarding to try and access old UA data, for instance. So you can still access that data. I probably need to be a bit more of a technical wizard to know another way to do a backup. Without BigQuery, I'm not sure a way of extracting all of that data. I'm not sure if it's possible. To identify user base on GA4, new metric definition, total number of unique users who logged an event. Does that mean they're required for a user to log in? No, users don't have to be logged in to be identified as a unique user. So there's two ways to identify, well, there's several ways to identify a user in GA4. The optimal way is user ID. That's the best way because then we get deduplication. But GA4 will also recognize users that don't have a user ID based on their cookie. So if you're looking at the schema that we have for the GA4 export, you'll see that there is a user ID field. If that's null, you still have a user pseudo ID, which is effectively the cookie. So they're still recognized, even if they're not logged in. Don't you worry about that. It's just that obviously we prefer to be using the user ID where we can. But yes, all visitors, regardless of login or not, are recognized as a unique user. Obviously, just keep in mind that we still have that limitation with cookies that you can't recognize the same person on web and on app if you're just using cookies. This is the value of user ID, is that that person is deduplicated and recognized as one user. As page view is an automatically collected event, can we add additional parameters to the default page view event? The answer is yes, you can do that. What I would recommend doing is in your config tag, you can set up automatically collected parameters that you want on all of your page views and user properties if that applies as well. So, on your page views, you probably have, you won't need to set up those automatically collected ones that are just collected by GA4. So you don't need to set up page path or language or location, whatever. But you can add things like content ID, content name, content author. You can put those in your page view config tag to collect those values. Something to be aware of, though, is that those will only apply once to the page you're on. So just think of it as something that's page level, right, for a page view. So something like author or article ID is best. You don't want to choose a value that could change as you go down the page, like scroll depth. So it might seem kind of obvious and intuitive, but yeah, we just want to make sure those page view parameters that are custom are still just page level values. Can we create a test view to experiment? Yes, absolutely. You can create a test property, it would be called in this case. So you would then have a data stream from your, ideally what you would have would be a development staging area in GTM. You'd have a data stream from there, and you would only look at your test data in that view. So I would recommend doing that so that you can kind of use that to do debugging, maybe on your development site, on your staging site. And that way, you can kind of analyze things in there before they go live. But yeah, slightly different to the idea we had in GA4. Your master view kind of is like automatically filtered for something that you'd often exclude from UA with filters. To confirm, if we've already set up dashboards connected to UA, we'll be able to see and export historical data. Yes, if you've got dashboards connected to UA, you can still access that data. It's not going away. The platform being sunset just means that the SLAs and the support aren't going to continue for that platform. The focus for Google is now on GA4, the new platform, but the data is still your data. You still have UA data. You can still access it with dashboards or in the platform itself. Okay, great questions, everyone. All right, we're up to the final little part here, and then I'll answer any other questions you guys have. So in terms of the way the pricing model works, let me walk you through this because you might be confused by the little food emojis on the screen, but I will explain. So with UA, some of you probably know, the way the pricing model worked was that you had your free version and then you had your paid version. And the paid version was fixed rate, right? So it was a fixed cost per year, and it didn't matter how big or small your organization was, that was the fixed cost. If you went over your hit limits, then you would have overage fees, and that was just kind of the fixed way that the pricing was done. With GA4, the pricing is tiered based on how many events you actually log. So if you're a smaller business, you're probably going to be saving money on GA4 compared to UA. Depending on the amount of events you have, you're probably going to fall into a lower tier. You won't necessarily have to pay the fixed cost that a large business would pay as well. So the monthly cost depends on the total amount of events consumed within a month. So, I was right. So the base fee is up to 25 million events per month, and that is the fixed pricing for tier 1. Every million events consumed above that tier will then have a multiplier applied. So it kind of works like a flattening out log curve for any of my maths nerds in the room. We start off with a higher rate for every extra million events you consume. And then the more you go, the higher you go up, the higher tiers you go up, you will then have a lower rate applied. So this bracket here, if you're consuming between 25 million and 500 million, you'll have a multiplier applied here. If you go above that, the multiplier is less. So it's not a standard set rate for every million all the way up. The rate will get lower for every million, for every bracket that you go above the base tier, if that makes sense. So this means that as a publisher, if you are small, you might just fit into this base tier. That might be all you have to worry about. If you're consuming, 5 billion events per month, you're going to fit into this tier. So you'll have these different multipliers applied, but they do get lower more events you go up. So I know it's a little bit complicated. It's a little bit mathematical, but the main thing to understand is just the way that the curve works, that the pricing does decrease. The pricing rate does decrease the more events you have. So basically, there's some examples here. If you are a small publisher with 8 million events, you're below the limit. You just have the base rate. 25 million events, again, base rate. 27 million. So you've gone 2 million events above the minimum. So you'll have this multiplier applied on top of your base rate. And then if you're consuming, 503 million, you're in this bracket here. So you'll have your base rate. You'll have this multiplier applied for the 475 million events that fall into this bracket. Then the next bracket up has a smaller multiplier applied. Okay. If you're not a maths person, this might be making your brain explode. But the key thing to understand is just that the tiering is not as fixed as it was in UA, that we will see a decrease in rate as you go up. Okay, that was everything I wanted to go over. Obviously, we're going to leave time for questions, but before we finish, just wanted to give you guys a little bit of closing info. So to summarize what we looked at today, we started off with some overviews of what a data-driven publisher business is and how to build one. We introduced GA4. We went through the differences between GA4 and UA, covered off some basic terminologies about, events and conversions and parameters and things like that. And then finally, we just covered off the roadmap and pricing. So we have another webinar next week, which is going over features and use cases for publishers. So just to give you some context, that will be where we kind of look at specific ways that you can use the platform as a publisher. So it's going to be a bit more specific than this kind of high level overview we've just done. So that's this time next week, exact same time next week. We have a post-webinar survey. We'd love to hear your feedback if you have any. And we, as I said, and as Chris mentioned, we will have support sessions as well. There'll be applications to take part in those. We're going to provide some more details on those in the third webinar, which will be in a couple of weeks. So, keep an eye out on the website as well for details on that if you would like to apply for support, one of those support sessions where we can kind of have a one-on-one and figure out the best way to get your implementation going. Okay, so feel free to ask questions. You already have, so I'm going to jump into them. But if you are jumping off, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate all the questions. It's nice when people are listening to me talk about data. So I appreciate it, and I hope I see you next week. But in the meantime, I'll just take a few minutes to answer the questions in the chat, and any others, feel free to shoot them through as well. Okay, first up, can real-time page views be done on GA4 through a script? So GA4 actually has a pretty strong real-time reporting functionality built in. The real-time API for GA4 is a real, it's very advanced compared to the UA one. So if you are someone who is, using scripts to build out your own reporting using the API, then definitely look into the GA4 real-time API. It's very strong. You can also, though, just automatically look at real-time data in the platform itself. So you'll find that in the reporting section, there is a real-time report as an overview. And then within each of your other overview reports, you also have real-time reporting available. So there's a big focus on it in GA4. So definitely look at the out-of-the-box reporting. You can also, if you are someone who is wanting to build more complicated or not complicated, more advanced real-time reporting tools, I'd recommend looking at streaming export for GA4, where you can continuously export to BigQuery and then use that to build dashboards for real-time content reporting, real-time social reporting. As I said, the API is really advanced for GA4 real-time. So beyond just the platform itself, using it in BigQuery and using the API to connect to other platforms is definitely recommended. Yes. Okay. If you have time, can you confirm you mentioned page path as being an example of a high cardinality custom dimension? You are correct if you're implying that I was wrong, because I was wrong. That was a bit of a slip up by me. I should have clarified. A high cardinality dimension is one that isn't a custom dimension. Isn't automatically collected. So page path is automatically collected, as we know, as a parameter. It's always available in GA4. As long as you're tracking page views, you're getting page path. So it's not high cardinality because you don't need to set up page path as a custom dimension. It's automatically collected. There's obviously page path reports in the platform. That was a silly example for me to use. It's better to think about something like article ID, which would be a custom dimension that you have to tell GA4 to collect and to recognize as custom. That's high cardinality because you might have millions of values for that. The main point is anything that's a custom dimension that you have set up yourself and sent to GA4 and that you have to configure in the platform as custom, that is where you should be thinking about cardinality and not turning on any dimensions that have a lot of values like article ID or publication timestamp, for instance. But as I said, all of those values, when you set them up in your data collection, are still going to the platform. It's just that the actual values are accessible in BigQuery unless you make them a custom dimension. So it's best to avoid putting things like article ID in as a custom dimension. You can do a lot of your analysis on content performance without having to get down to that individual granular level. Okay, thank you for that. And that was my mistake. For paywall content, is it possible to track scroll depth? Is it possible to track events inside paywall? Yes, absolutely. This is more of a question for your developers and for whoever works on your CMS, because this will be dependent on what they can do. But yes, you can certainly track when someone sees a paywall, when someone hits a paywall, and when someone is able to get past a paywall. We have details on this, I think, in our third webinar. It's one of the recommended events we have for publishers. So it's definitely possible to do. Often the paywall will be like a feature of the site code. So for your developers, it will be relatively easy to log a data layer event when someone has a paywall appear or when someone hits the paywall. So yes, it would have to be implemented on your site as an event to be tracked, but 100% possible, and it's a really good call out to track that. Absolutely. GA4 will be having the same process of collecting data from routes folder like subdomain, just like before. If this means, will it be collecting data from website subdomains in the same way that UA does, then yes is the answer, that it should recognize the same it should be able to log the same event, on the subdomain as the primary domain. Apologies if I misunderstand that, but I think that's what you're saying. Cool. Why is there a page view gap between UA and GA4, and how can GA4 integration with AMP pages be done? Okay, so I would say the page view gap is probably due to the fact that the AMP integration is still pending. So as you know, GA4 is very new. There's still some features on the roadmap that aren't quite ready yet. This is one that probably would be affecting you if you use AMP pages. So I would suggest that that's probably what the discrepancy is. I have a publisher client who similarly has a bit of a discrepancy because of AMP tracking kind of still being in the pipeline. But apart from that, you should be seeing similar page view numbers between web and app. Again, we just want to make sure we've got only the config tag to track page views and not a separate page view event. If you're seeing big discrepancies beyond that, it's worth digging into looking at individual pages on particular days and seeing if there might be something going wrong. Going onto the site, maybe looking at when these events are logging. Is there a lot of latency on GA4 pushing through a page view versus UA, for instance? I would probably go into debug mode if I was seeing a really big discrepancy that wasn't accounted for by the AMP difference. And in that case, it would most likely be due to an issue with the tracking setup. If you're trying to do dual tagging at the moment, which is recommended, then I would be trying to ensure that those GA4 and UA tags are logging at pretty much exactly the same time, so that you don't have that difference between page views. How to audit whether GA4 code is correctly implemented through the site or not? That is a great question. I guess one way is what we were just discussing. So looking at a comparison with UA and seeing if you've got the similar numbers there. Another way is there are a lot of tools you can use to crawl and check tracking on your site. I believe GTM has actually just introduced one of these where you can audit through Tag Manager and make sure that tags are appearing on all the pages on your site. I haven't used it myself, but I noticed that is something new in GTM, so I would look into that. Also, there's other tools like Data.True that enable you to kind of run an audit on your site to make sure it's all there. So if you're worried about whether the tag is firing on all the pages, then I would use GTM's tracker or something like Data.True. If you're worried about whether or not you're collecting the right parameters, sometimes you just kind of got to do a mini audit yourself, where you'll go onto the site, look at what's being logged using something like Omnibug, which is a really handy tool for debugging. And you can just kind of check that, sense check that everything's coming through as you expect. Those are the main ways. I would, compare with UA, use a site crawler, and use Omnibug to look at the actual logged events on site. Possible reasons for page view event latency in GA4. One would be if for some reason you might find that your UA page view event was originally set up with a really high priority, and that you might have other events in GTM that have a high priority set. So that's something we can do in GTM that will tell tags to fire in a certain order. So that might be one reason. You might want to check, when's UA firing a tag and when's GA4 firing a tag? Can we make them both have the same priority? Another reason might just be speed issues on the page itself. So have a look at your site speed and see if things are loading at the right times. make sure that the GTM container is loaded and that the page event is firing after the page is actually loaded, for instance. So usually, if we see a big drop in page views, it can be due to things like, due to latency on the actual site itself, or funny priorities in GTM that are worth having a look into. And try giving your GA4 tag a really high priority, and seeing if that helps with your config tag, so that it fires basically as soon as someone loads the page, and so you don't get that latency. Okay. Oh my gosh, so many good questions. Does anyone else have another question? We've got about 5 minutes left that I can stick around. Otherwise, I would love you to bring any other questions you have to webinar 2 or 3. I think we are probably going to address a lot of the questions you've had that are more technical in the next couple of sessions. So we do talk about tag implementation, for example. And let me have a quick look here. Do we have any more coming through? I've got a few more questions I can answer. I'm going to probably stop in the next 5 minutes, a 1:15, but I would say, if you do have a lot of questions, I would definitely recommend having a look out for the details on our support sessions, and so that we can kind of have one-on-ones if you do need support with your implementation, and also coming to the rest of the trainings where you might find some of your questions answered. In terms of looking at some of these questions, we've got one here about we've implemented both UA and GA4 in reports pertaining to campaign source. We currently see that unique users reported by GA4 are a bit lower than the same in UA. Since GA4 is App Plus Web, should it be higher, not lower than UA? Not necessarily, because App Plus Web, the idea is that we're deduplicating users. So you will probably see that users are slightly lower because you're not recognizing the same person as 2 people anymore, right? So in UA, you often will have overcounting of users between app and web. With GA4, you're consolidating the definition into one user. So that makes sense to me that there would be a lower number of users for campaign source, because I'm seen as 1 person in GA4, whereas I was seen as 2 in UA, which was inaccurate. For the month of January, I think I discussed this one, the extra page views. Again, my main recommendation would be to look at the config tag and to make sure you're not double logging page view events. Go onto the site yourself and use Omnibug and see if you're accidentally logging 2 page views. We've already set up GA4 and we've been monitoring events and comparing them with the metrics we have on UA. What could be the reason we're not seeing the same number of page views? Does it have something to do with the limit on events that free GA4 can monitor? Again, we've kind of discussed this a fair bit, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you're having weird page view issues, step 1, check the config tag. Step 2, go into UA and GA4, drill down into a date and a page and see if there's a difference, and try and figure out where these differences might be occurring. Maybe it's just one section of your site. Maybe the tag isn't implemented everywhere on the site. Maybe it's something like that. So highly recommend doing a little bit of a deep analysis where you pick out specific pages and try to figure out if it's every page has a 20% discrepancy, or just these pages have a 80% discrepancy. So I do a bit of that, a little bit of digging. And the third thing I would do is to use Omnibug on the page, check the latency of the tags, see if the tags are firing at the same time. You might find that the UA tag fires first, and then 20 seconds later, GA4 page view tag fires, which means you need to do a bit of work on priority of the tag and maybe of page speed, and ensuring that that container is loaded nice and early. GA4 is showing real-time in the last 30 minutes. Can we expect to see last 5 minutes or actual real-time traffic? Any big news publisher, the real-time traffic is very important. Yes, absolutely. So real time, when GA4 says we're showing real time in the last 30 minutes, yeah, that just means that that's within the last 30 minutes. It doesn't mean that was 30 minutes ago. It means within the last 30 minutes. The real-time streaming happens every few minutes. If you are really interested in getting super up-to-date data and knowing exactly when it's coming through, again, I'd recommend using the streaming export because that will give you visibility on what's coming through and when it's coming through. And that way you can kind of build more advanced real-time dashboards or real-time reports with that data. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really valuable tool for publishers. I recommend that. Considerable difference in real time in GA3 and GA4. Yes, so I did mention this before. In GA3, the real-time API wasn't as strong as the new one we have for GA4. So I think that's probably why you're seeing more events coming through. The GA4 real-time API is really, really good, basically. So you're probably going to see a lot more accurate data in the GA4 version. Also, remember that UA is, being sunset, so it's not necessarily going to have the same level of accuracy in something like real-time feature compared to GA4, which is the most up-to-date technology. So I would be trusting the GA4 real-time data for sure. And one more, we've noticed that paid meta traffic is appearing in GA4 as organic social. So we don't embed UTMs into our articles when the links are posted to Meta. It doesn't appear we can change the UTM of an organic post once boosted on Meta. Any ideas on how we can measure this accurately? Okay, yeah, good question. I know that some custom channel groupings are on the roadmap for GA4, so that will be one solution. Apart from that, because it's a default channel grouping, you do need to basically adhere to the UTM's recommend or defined either default channel grouping rules for them to go into the channels you want them to. So, for example, from Facebook, you need to have something in your medium that's CPC or paid. Otherwise, it will go to organic. So, unfortunately, if you can't change the UTM once it's boosted, it might be something where you can use Data Studio if it's something you want to report on in there, or you might be able to set up a custom definition as an additional parameter if you want to modify that session start event. There are a few different ways you could do it. If I were you, I would probably use Looker Studio. I keep forgetting that the name is different. I would probably use Looker Studio, connect GA4 to that, and just set up a report just for your meta traffic where you can set a custom field and say anything from here, anything that's got a FB cleared, for instance, that is paid social. And you can kind of create some distinct definitions for your social reporting in there. I'd probably do that in the meantime until we have the custom channel rules. Obviously, the ideal thing would be to change your UTMs, but if that's not possible, that's what I would do. Okay. I think that's everything. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions. Hopefully, I will see some of you next week and going forward. But for now, have a wonderful afternoon and a fabulous weekend.